In this news roundup for the week, Germany locks down the unvaccinated and signals a vote on mandatory vaccination. The Women's Tennis Association cancels all events in China over the missing Peng Shuai. And the US Supreme Court starts a process of the overthrow of Roe v. Wade. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. The current surge of COVID infections across the European mainland has the EU flirting with the idea of compulsory vaccination for all. As you probably know, this started with Austria, which announced that vaccination would be compulsory for all adults from February next year. Germany's new chancellor-elect, Olaf Scholz, is apparently a fan, and he said this week that once he's sworn in, his government would be putting a compulsory vaccination law before Parliament within weeks. Recognising this might not be to everybody's taste, he did promise that the vote on the measure would be a free vote, so MPs could vote with their conscience, but Scholz made clear that he would be voting for it. This was put out there side by side with a measure enacted yesterday to ban unvaccinated people from shops and bars. They are allowed to meet only 2 people from outside their household at a time, and a raft of other measures. Outgoing Chancellor Angela Merkel described the move as an act of national solidarity, which is an interesting reframing of that concept. It mirrors the measure that was taken by Austria for about 5.5 minutes before they tossed it aside in favour of a lockdown for everybody. Greece is part of the way there. This week it announced that it would make vaccination mandatory for over 60s, with tough fines for any that refuse. Other EU countries might choose not to go there, but should they even be given the choice? Well, not necessarily, according to the EU President Ursula von der Leyen, and all of course because of the arrival of Omicron. The terrifying mutation that may be more transmissible, but we don't know for sure yet, and may be more deadly, although so far we've only seen mild cases, and may be able to laugh in the face of vaccines, although we don't know that yet either. But nevertheless, it's terrifying enough that von der Leyen said that European Union countries must consider mandatory vaccination to tackle the spread of the highly contagious (maybe) Omicron variant. Really though, von der Leyen didn't really hide the fact that the real driver for her push was just her frustration at the large numbers of people across the bloc, around 150 million of them, who have opted not to get vaccinated. In what was described as a rallying cry, she urged the EU member states to step up their vaccination campaigns, roll out booster doses, consider new travel restrictions, and all, of course, because of Omicron. Von der Leyen said this: how we can encourage and potentially think about mandatory vaccination within the European Union, this needs discussion. This needs a common approach, but it is a discussion, I think, that has to be met. Now, that's all very well, but the EU actually has no competence to impose any such thing on its member states, something that von der Leyen conceded when it was put to her. This seems to be an enormous disappointment, which is curious because I can't think of anything more likely to sabotage the European project quicker than being seen to cram down compulsory medication on the citizens of member states. Why you would think that would work to your advantage, I cannot possibly imagine. Now, in spite of my satire, Omicron remains an entirely open question. Of course, there is no evidence currently one way or the other on the variant, and the only sensible stance is to reserve judgment. Updates will be coming probably on a daily basis over the next couple of weeks. Early indications support but don't yet prove that it has high transmissibility and that it can reinfect people who previously had COVID more effectively than Delta could, although only so far with the consequence of mild disease. If you watch this video a day after upload, 2 days after upload, may already have been updated. GlaxoSmithKline have said that its new monoclonal antibody drug has been shown to work against Omicron, so that's a thing. However, it's hard to ignore the fact that in the name of exercising caution, some lawmakers are using it to justify continuing pushes on the things they wanted to do already. Europe was flirting with compulsory vaccination before Omicron, simply because of the current COVID wave. It's interesting because it puts the countries concerned, still just a tiny minority remember, into a very tiny category of countries worldwide. We talk about authoritarian China, determined to hold on to zero COVID, but even authoritarian China has not implemented a compulsory vaccination program. These countries are making themselves outliers in this, apparently with the wholehearted support of their populations, by the way. Polls in Germany suggest that compulsory vaccination is supported by around 2/3 of the public, which is almost all of the 68.7% of the population that has been fully vaccinated. So in Germany at least, if you've done your bit and gotten vaccinated, you think everyone else should be forced to do the same. I expect the percentages will vary, but I'd be surprised if that wasn't a consistent finding across many countries, given the way the discourse has developed in recent months. Needless to say, the people on the other side are being quick to describe it as a full-on descent into totalitarian nightmare. Such descriptions are overblown, but they carry force because there's a germ of truth. It's striking how quickly certain policy responses become a habit once you've crossed the line for the first time. Meanwhile, in the UK, the panic push to get booster shots to everyone, regardless of their age, even if just 3 months since they got their second vaccination shot, we're seeing the pushback from GPs, pointing out the unintended consequences. Doctors have said they will now have to scale back their usual care to meet the government's aim for boosters for all by the end of January. That includes things like the Quality Outcomes Framework, where they take checks on people with diabetes, high blood pressure and other conditions that could leave them at higher risk of having a heart attack or a stroke. One official said they're talking about a partial suspension of QOF, but they may as well just bin it. The good news is that after some momentary confusion on the subject, the government has officially confirmed that you're allowed to snog strangers at the Christmas party. Because we all look to the government for guidance on such things, obviously. They should never have got rid of Matt Hancock, at least he could have led by example. Now in the US, President Biden, who blamed his predecessor for COVID and said that if he'd been president, most of the deaths would have been prevented, he continues to urge people to get vaccinated to largely zero effect. This week he unveiled what was described as a wide-ranging plan to avoid winter resurgence of the virus, but Politico reported that the plan really comprised of continuations or modest expansions of existing initiatives, and some experts doubt they will do much to change the pandemic's current trajectory. Health law professor Lawrence Gostin said he's facing a hostile public, a hostile political opposition and a hostile judiciary. And so the only things left to do are things that are largely ineffective. Biden's alternative to the German approach of mandatory vaccination was to push the mandate through employers, requiring firms with more than 100 employees to require vaccination of their staff or regular testing. That got put on hold by the courts, and this week moderate Democrat Joe Manchin said that he would support a GOP attempt to vote the business mandate down in a Senate vote next week. Now, it's not a decisive vote because their motion to cancel the initiative wouldn't then pass the House, and even if it did, it could still be vetoed by Biden himself. The outcome on that measure will still come down to what happens in the courts. Meanwhile, the Women's Tennis Association has massively ratcheted up the confrontation with the Chinese Communist Party to a degree that we've simply not seen from any sporting institution to date. We'll come to that in just a minute. But first, what's really happening in the Arctic? It's one of those areas where the different sides on the climate change discussion just routinely, flatly contradict each other about what's factually going on and what it means. One side will show one graph which seems valid, showing one story. The other will show another graph which also seems valid, showing the complete opposite. Some of the campaigners predict an imminent sea ice-free Arctic summer and predict calamitous consequences should that happen. And others point to the fact that predictions on such an event have come and gone, and the most extreme say that we're not even making progress in that direction at all. So, what's the truth behind it all? What's really happening in the Arctic, and what does it mean? That's what I'll be looking at in the next deep dive video to go live on this channel on Monday next week, 7 PM UK time. Join me for that. The WTA, the Women's Tennis Association, made good on its promise this week to pull from all events scheduled for China unless they saw movement on Peng Shuai, the player who recently accused a high-ranking Communist Party official of sexual abuse. Peng has been out of circulation since she made her social media post on the topic, which was pulled after 20 minutes, and discussion of her is currently being censored on the Chinese internet. Shortly after the WTA started making noises about the case, several attempts were made apparently to quell the momentum. Photos posted showing Peng in social situations, an email purporting to have been written by her, which had a tone of voice you could only consider incongruous at best. They were risible, clumsy interventions that only made things worse as far as most observers were concerned. Interestingly, the International Olympic Committee, which went out of its way not to confront or criticise China, has reported that it's been able to hold 2 video conversations with Peng Shuai and adopted what can only be described as something of a superior attitude to the WTA. It released a statement yesterday praising itself. There are different ways to achieve her well-being and safety. We have taken a very human and person-centred approach to her situation. We are using quiet diplomacy, which, given the circumstances and based on the experience of governments and other organisations, is indicated to be the most promising way to proceed effectively in such humanitarian matters. The IOC's efforts led to a half-hour video conference with Peng Shuai on 21st November, during which she explained her situation and appeared to be safe and well, given the difficult situation she is in. That very last phrase is the only acknowledgement the organisation makes in relation to the role of China. But of course, it's rather obvious. She interacted far more on a week-to-week basis with WTA over her career, but it's the IOC she's been having calls with. The only reason is because the IOC has not criticised China, so they are rewarded. The WTA has confronted them, so it is punished. These are not the priorities she herself would have made, so it seems self-evident that her interactions are not under her own control. I think it's likely that fears for her actual bodily safety are overblown. But given recent history, I'd be surprised if, when she finally re-emerges into public, she doesn't retire from professional tennis and her previous accusations will never be spoken of again. Maybe that's wrong, in which case we should expect to see her at the Australian Open tournament early next year, presumably. I'm not holding my breath on that one. How does this play out with institutions? That is a more open question. So the WTA will now no longer operate tournaments in China, but if Peng doesn't make a reappearance, presumably it will continue to highlight the issue and be confrontational. This is not a running theme that the Chinese government will welcome. Normally it uses the threat of pulling funding in order to quiet such critiques, and that has been tremendously effective for them in the past. But this week the WTA effectively shot its rabbit by voluntarily taking the hit and pulling from all such events. So how else will it apply pressure? Will it demand that other Chinese tennis players pull from the tour? Will it put pressure on other countries to pull WTA events? And assuming that it plays out how I predicted, that Peng re-emerges into the Open in China in a few months, but resigns from the tour and never seeks to travel again, at what point does the WTA then end its boycott? And what should happen here? On the one hand, the WTA is being entirely consistent with its values as a Western women's organisation. If a woman makes such an allegation of sexual abuse, it should be investigated with proper due process. But the challenge of being an international sporting body is you necessarily include countries that are not democracies and are not Western values oriented and will not do things the same way. Do you seek to force them to comply to your own values and system, or do you accept the sovereignty of all participants and you simply see sport as the bridge across systems, the one part where you identify a common value? Both are potentially valid. The former is the WTA approach. We have a global network of women's tennis. We will play wherever countries will operate in the spirit of the tour. And its recent move gained the widespread and enthusiastic approval of its players and other stakeholders. But the latter is the Olympic ideal. The aim to be inclusive of all nations if possible. And the reason why just about every Olympics where someone's calling for a boycott because it's being hosted by someone less than perfect, the answer has always been no. The IOC can definitely be criticised for how it's provided rather active cover for China here, which you'd think went above and beyond what was necessary. But for all that they're being rather insufferable about loudly boasting about their quiet diplomacy, it's not as though they don't have a point. It's just that both organisations with very different missions are finding their way through very different stakeholder groups who will only tolerate one approach or the other. Meanwhile, in the US, it's starting to sink in that a much predicted earthquake in the legal status quo may be about to hit. We'll get to that in just a minute. But first, it's the start of a new month, and that means it's time for another live stream. We'll be talking about the topical issues of the moment and then picking up your questions asked live in the chat. And there's certainly loads to talk about. So join me for that, going live at 7 p.m. UK time, Wednesday next week. See you there. This week, the US Supreme Court started the process that will potentially lead to the unwinding of the country's abortion status quo, with a case that invites it to overthrow the important precedent of Roe v. Wade. It's been one of the flashpoint issues dividing the country on partisan lines for decades, an issue where the mere prospect of decisive change against your position has been used to mobilise the faithful to get out the vote in election after election. But now, with the Supreme Court in the US, a weirdly political institution as it is, being decisively weighted to one side for the first time in decades, Republican states have been pushing cases towards it with the hope of achieving exactly that decisive change. And the leading case was heard for the first time this week, and numerous commentators interpreted the day's hearing and the questions the various justices asked as signalling that the Conservative majority has the appetite to go for the big shift. Should Roe v. Wade be overturned, the effect is to say that the issue of abortion is not considered a federal issue. It's considered to be the sort of matter that gets decided at a state level. Should that happen, there's around 26 states that are poised to ban or severely restrict abortions. 12 already have what are called trigger bans in place, laws that have been passed but are unenforceable unless Roe v. Wade should be overturned. 8 other states had bans that predated Roe v. Wade that would come back into force. The case in front of the Supreme Court is a Mississippi law that would ban abortion after 15 weeks into pregnancy. Roe v. Wade sets the time limit as being that of fetus viability, when it would be able to survive outside the womb, generally held to be around 22 to 24 weeks. In that timing, it's similar to the law in the UK, which has 24 weeks. In the UK, the issue is not party politicised, since historical votes on it were free votes. MPs were able to vote with their conscience. The UK population massively supports that status quo, with, according to at least one poll, just 5% opposing. But the Mississippi law isn't outside the bounds of reasonable argument. Other G7 countries, such as Germany, ban abortions after the first trimester, so 12 weeks, and even then you have to accept compulsory counselling. In France, it's up to 12 weeks on demand, but thereafter only if 2 physicians certify that it's needed to prevent grave physical or mental harm to the mother. But the only member of the Supreme Court in the US who seemed interested in establishing a new standard around the Mississippi law of 15 weeks was Justice John Roberts, who is known for seeking compromise solutions. It seemed that his Conservative colleagues were not much attracted to such a middle ground, since it retains the principle that it's the federal government's remit and responsibility. And there's not much doubt that if they go full out for the end of Roe v. Wade, first of all, there will be an explosion of rage across America, which will not subside quickly. Secondly, the standard of Republican bans will quickly go to 0. It will not stick at 15 or 12. Of course, also in the queue, next to the Mississippi law, is one from Texas that sets the limit at 6 weeks, which is as good as a ban in practical terms. So then you will have women in around half of the country who will have to travel to a neighbouring state if they are determined to get an abortion. It's one of those classic US situations that is mainly where it is because of its constant chronic gridlock and inability to legislate any issue without it being on a partisan basis. So you end up with measures pushed into inappropriate vehicles because it turns out to be the only way you can get them implemented. So for instance, that's how you got a totally different subject, CO2, being declared a pollutant in the US. Not because it makes a huge amount of sense to talk about it in exactly that way, but because only by doing that could it, under existing rules, be regulated by the EPA. It was an attempt to get climate legislation implemented when you couldn't get such legislation passed through Congress. And so it was here. The use of the Supreme Court to come up with a creative way to rule that something is protected by the Constitution when logically, really, it kind of isn't. The left did it with Roe v. Wade and abortion. The right did it with the Second Amendment and the pretense that the founders had any inkling of the modern debate around gun ownership. And because they were flimsy uses of the Constitution for things that should have been debated and passed as laws properly, they were always vulnerable to being overturned should the political balance of the court go one way, as it now has. Because whether you support the outcomes or not, the mechanism wasn't the right mechanism. It was just the only one to hand that could possibly work when the political process was broken. In any case, the die is cast. The court will begin its discussions and debates for an extended period now before the final outcome is thrown like a rock into a still pool, just because the country hasn't been lively or divided enough lately. How do you feel about the obstacles in your life? All those things getting in the way of you being able to achieve what you would wish to do. I mean, I don't know your life, but I'm willing to bet you have those obstacles because, everybody does. And people who don't have serious obstacles seem to go out their way to create them in their own minds, hence the fashion in some student circles for obsessing about so-called microaggressions. Such people should reflect on the words of Marcus Aurelius: choose not to be harmed, and you won't feel harmed. Don't feel harmed, and you haven't been. Of course, he would probably just be dismissed as some dead white guy. But many of the heroes of those people, the Gandhis, the Nelson Mandelas, they came through times of incarceration by their enemies because of precisely that mindset. Mahatma Gandhi wrote a book called Stone Walls Do Not a Prison Make. They could throw you in jail, but they couldn't take away your real power. And those people then turned their prisons into universities and workshops where they changed themselves. And they changed their prisons into schoolhouses where they changed others. Now, of course, you will face obstacles because life is full of them. Is that a bad thing or is it a good thing? All the inspiring stories we tell each other about the people who changed the world, who excelled in sport or in war or whatever it is, just led good lives, those are stories about people overcoming obstacles. People who think that their life should be an absence of obstacles, where they can simply leap without hindrance to get whatever they want, those people end up angry and bitter and frustrated, and they miss the whole point. Overcoming obstacles is the achievement that makes life meaningful. Overcoming obstacles on behalf of others is a service that is worth rendering. And the point is that by choosing what you want your life's purpose to be, what you want to be about, that is a process of choosing your obstacles. And then since you chose them, you can be that much more positive about facing up to them, however hard to overcome they turn out to be, whatever the cost turns out to be of doing so. Every person who became a better person did so because they overcame an obstacle. Every sports person who became a world champion did so because they lost a lot of games, and each time they learned something new about the obstacles they had to overcome to get to the top. Most of us don't aspire to such huge ambitions, becoming the best in our field worldwide, but we still have the question, always. If you want to be better, stronger, more satisfied, then you have to find the right obstacles and not waste time with the wrong ones. Embrace them as the route to improvement. The rules of the game of life. That which doesn't kill me makes me stronger. It's become a cliche principally because it's true. All right. My main obstacle on this channel currently remains that since the algorithm tweak in March, YouTube doesn't promote these videos hardly at all to non-subscribers. When it did, the channel was growing at 100 per day. Since March the 6th, hardly at all. Which is exactly why I make time to mention every week that I simply couldn't put the time into making these videos and working to break through those barriers without my Patreon supporters. Not only does it provide funding for that, but it is the added motivation as well. Having a core of people who are committed to seeing you succeed, who are cheering you on. I'm grateful for all of that, more than you could know. If you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please go along to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.